Today we'll be discussing social stratification, race, and ethnicity. So let's begin to define what is race, what is ethnicity. We oftentimes hear the term race being used, and it's used incorrectly. When we use the term race, we have to understand that it refers to a division of people based on certain physical characteristics. It's a classification, it's a categorization of individuals based on superficial means. Race is based on the color of one's skin, the shape of one's eyes, the texture of one's hair, the shape of one's nose. It has nothing to do with ability. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It's basically, what can I visually see? When we talk about race, view it as judging a book by its cover. But think about how limited that is. Think about the fact that some individuals from a particular racial or ethnic group may have darker skin or lighter skin, and maybe can be confused for being a member of a different group. Let's look at Mexico, for example. If you go to certain regions of Mexico, you might find individuals with very, very light skin, green eyes or blue eyes, blonde hair. And at first sight, you may automatically assume that those individuals must be foreigners visiting Mexico from Europe, from the United States, perhaps like Laguna Beach or something. Until you walk up to those individuals and you begin to converse with them. And in conversing with them, you realize, oh, wow, they're not European. They're not from Laguna Beach. They're Mexican. They speak Spanish. Or you might see an individual walking down the street with darker skin and automatically classify that individual as African American. But upon conversing with that individual, you realize that they're from Cuba, that they're from the Dominican Republic. So as sociologists, we need to learn to not judge a book by its cover. We need to adopt that sociological perspective, where we go into new interactions as a blank canvas. And we allow the interaction, the experience to paint a picture for us. When we look at the US Census Bureau, which obviously right now is being collected, data is being collected. US Census Bureau collects data every 10 years. So if your family hasn't completed the US Census Bureau survey, I encourage you to please do so. And what the US Census Bureau does is it breaks up the population into 6 different racial categories. You have white, you have Black or African American, you have American Indian or Alaska Native, you have Asian, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, or other race. If you notice, Latinos, Hispanics are not on this list. And there's a good reason for that. Latino Hispanic is not considered a race, it is considered an ethnicity. And we'll talk about ethnicity in a little bit. But just keep that in mind, that when you're filling out a survey, when you're filling out a job application, depending on what region of the United States you're in, they may say white, non-Hispanic, white, Hispanic. I want to go a step further with this, and we'll tackle the Latino Hispanic population and our selection of other race, oftentimes on demographic data a little later. But let's go back to judging a book by its cover. Let's be honest. A majority of Americans do not realize that Egypt, individuals who identify as Egyptian, are not Middle Eastern. A majority of individuals who identify as Egyptian are actually African. So on a US Census Bureau survey, they would actually mark African American. A majority of Americans in certain parts of the country didn't understand that Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, and that Puerto Ricans, although they identify as Puerto Ricans, also identify as Americans. And I wonder why. Why didn't certain segments of our population in the United States acknowledge the fact that Puerto Ricans are Americans? Well, it's fairly simple. When you look at the stereotypical image of what an American is supposed to look like, people oftentimes assume we're talking about white individuals, we're talking about blonde hair or brown hair individuals, we're talking about individuals who have lighter skin tones, we're talking about individuals who may have green or blue eyes, that's the stereotypical American. But now you're looking at Puerto Ricans and they have brown skin. You're looking at Puerto Ricans and many speak Spanish as their only language. And people scratch their head and say, well, how can they be Americans? That's an example of the bias, the prejudice of America. This idea that if you don't fit the stereotypical category, that you're somehow less than. And so let's continue with this. Think about how we begin to label individuals who are multiracial, multi-ethnic. What we know is about 7% of Americans, as of the 2010 US Census survey, we'll get the updated numbers sometime next year for 2020. But in 2010, remember the census is taken every 10 years, 7% of the American population identified as two or more racial identities. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this PowerPoint. But let us return to this concept of ethnicity. So why are Latinos, Hispanics listed as an ethnic group and not as a racial group? Well, when we talk about ethnicity, it's different than race because it links a person's culture to his or her identity. We're talking about a sense of belonging. We're talking about a common language, a common ancestry, perhaps even common geography. All these factors come into play when we talk about ethnicity. So remember, when it comes to taking a quiz or when it comes to taking the final exam, race deals with physical characteristics, superficial means by which we prejudge individuals and categorize individuals, and ethnicity deals with a person's culture, a person's sense of belonging, a common language, ancestry, and geography. Now, what we want to understand is that in many ways, America is a melting pot because you have an expansion of immigration of the general population. You see an expansion of intermarriage, meaning individuals may be marrying in other people of a different race or ethnic background. And so relying on physical characteristics to determine one's identity is incredibly irresponsible. As I gave the examples of light-skinned individuals in Mexico, of darker-skinned individuals who may be of Dominican or Cuban descent. We want to keep that in mind. Let's not practice irresponsibility. Let's practice responsibility by learning about individuals rather than prejudging individuals. So let's look at the intermarriage rates here in the United States. In 1967, about 3% of Americans were married to a person of a different race or ethnicity. Remember, there were laws on the books throughout the United States that said if you were a person of color, you were not allowed to conceive a child or marry a white individual, especially if you were a person of color who was male, who was attempting to marry a white female. You could be arrested for that. If you haven't had the opportunity, I'd encourage you to watch the movie Loving. It's about the Loving court case that existed, I believe, in the state of Virginia, where a white man and an African-American woman were attempting to be married. They eventually did get married. They were in Washington, D.C., I believe. They had children together, but how they were living their life as criminals. And they didn't commit a vicious crime against anyone. They were living their life as criminals because in the United States at that point, it was illegal, especially in the state of Virginia, for a white person and an African-American person to be married. And so you can see that contributing, right? Even though Loving passed and the Loving case passed and people were allowed to marry individuals of other ethnic or racial groups, you can still see the effects in 1967 of intermarriage. Now, in 2015, 1 in 6 newlyweds in the United States were married to a person of a different race or ethnicity. In 2015, 4 out of 10 Americans believed that marrying someone of a different ethnicity or race was good for society, as opposed to only 24% of individuals who were surveyed in 2010. What we know is that in 2015, and we'll get the updated numbers in 2020, 2021, 39% of Hispanics and 46% of Asians were married to someone of a different race or ethnicity. And remember, this is not across the board, across the United States. We're going to look at a map in a little bit of where individuals are getting married to members of other races or ethnicities. And in 2015, 14% of US infants identified as multiracial or multi-ethnic. And so we look at this. The darker the shade of green, that means the higher rate or higher percentage of individuals who are marrying someone of a different race or ethnicity. And I'm guessing this map, at least on the West Coast, is not shocking anyone. If you live in a diverse community, there is a higher possibility that you will date and possibly marry someone of a different race or ethnicity because of the availability of partners. If there's no diversity in your community and everyone looks like you, well, you're kind of limited in the partners that you can have outside of your own race or ethnic group. But in California, where we're a very diverse state, you have a plethora of options of partners from different race and ethnic groups. But I want you to look at this. Look at parts of the country that lack any form of intermarriage or have such an insignificant amount of intermarriages that they don't even get a shade. North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Maine, virtually non-existent. But then you look at California, you look at Nevada, this is about the Las Vegas area, right? You look at Arizona, you look at New Mexico around the Albuquerque area, you look at the larger areas in Texas, more populated areas, you look at Florida, right? You look at parts of the Northeast. Now you're starting to see larger segments of the population marrying individuals of a different race or ethnicity. You look at these little charts here. We look here at about 4 in 10 U.S. intermarried couples include one Hispanic and one white spouse. So yes, so about 42% of intermarriages are between a white individual and Hispanic individual, followed by 15%, which are a white individual and Asian individual, and so on and so forth. You look at babies being born in 1980, only about 5% of babies identified as multiracial or multi-ethnic. As we mentioned before, now we're at about 14% in 2015. In 2020, I assume that the numbers will probably be in the 20% range, maybe a little higher than that. Now, let's look at this concept of majority versus minority group. In 2010, and we'll get the updated numbers with the 2020 census, whites made up approximately 63.7% of the US population. Due to their numerical representation, white individuals are considered the majority. But what we want to understand is that the majority group, or that title being the majority, is not exclusive to just numerical representation. When we use the term majority, we're also talking about the group that holds significant power and holds significant privilege in the United States. We want to understand that minority groups oftentimes refer to any group that holds less power than the majority group. The idea that minority groups are oftentimes forced to face oppression, discrimination, prejudice. That minority groups are oftentimes forgotten groups that are excluded from opportunities. I want you to think about the unequal treatments that minorities in the United States have experienced compared to the privilege of the dominant group, the privilege of the majority. That minorities may share a collective sense of being discriminated against. When we use the term white privilege, it doesn't mean that the white population is richer. It doesn't mean that the white population has 2 cars and a 3-car garage and a home. That's not white privilege. White privilege is that your skin color was not an obstacle for you. That your skin color did not create barriers that led you to be treated unequally simply because you are a darker shade. We hear these pundits on television saying white privilege doesn't exist. And I look at those individuals and I ask them, have you ever read a history book? Because if you read a history book, it is filled with white privilege. One of the greatest examples of white privilege relates to our K-12 education experience. As I mentioned earlier, we don't hear about the brutality and the atrocities in great detail that have occurred in the United States and that were often led by the dominant majority group. We get watered down versions. We get these versions of Thanksgiving, Native Americans beating the Pilgrims, for example. Oh, they broke bread together, right? The Native Americans, they taught them how to survive in the Americas. Okay, but let's keep it real. At one point, Native Americans made up 100% of the population in what is labeled the United States of America. Today, they make up less than 1%. Native Americans were murdered. Native Americans were forced to assimilate into American culture. Native Americans were stripped of their land, placed on reservations that are economically deprived and resource deprived. And what we've seen is that basically, anytime the United States needs Native American reservation land, they break treaties, they break agreements. But you don't hear that in our history books. And think about the fact that we don't hear about what happened to the Japanese in great detail post Pearl Harbor. They make it seem like, oh, they rounded up all the Japanese and the Japanese went to go live in these internment camps. Well, let's keep it real. They were concentration camps. But let's keep it real in the sense that let's hear the stories and let's tell the stories of individuals who lived in those concentration camps. I have a buddy of mine that I smoke cigars with. His name is James. James is in his mid-80s, maybe a little older. As we smoke cigars, James shares with me his childhood experiences of growing up in San Jose, of he and his family being forced to live in these Japanese concentration camps. He was from San Jose, but he was relocated to Arizona. How his family members were essentially rounded up, including himself at a very young age. They were forced to leave everything. They were placed in these concentration camps where there was no sense of privacy, where they were going hungry. He told me that his dad and his uncles would catch rattlesnakes and then cook their meat. How his mom, in these large bunkers essentially, she would hang blankets or sheets over on a string, on a rope, to provide a sense of privacy, just kind of say like, hey, this is our sectioned off area for our family. He talked about after his family left the concentration camp, that his grandfather returned to his farm or his land in San Jose, and there was a family living in it. That it took his grandfather years in court to finally get his home back. Because here's what happened. Japanese families were forced to leave their homes, to leave their livelihood. Yet guess what? The bills didn't stop coming. The banks didn't automatically say, oh, you're Japanese. Oh, don't worry about paying your mortgage or paying your rents. No, people were robbed of everything they had. He shared with me an experience that he still recalls today of being interviewed by an American soldier who asked him at the age of 4 or 5 years old, is your loyalty to the United States or to Japan? Imagine being that young and being asked that question. My son Gavin is 7 years old. I don't think he would know how to answer that question. But this is America's history that we don't teach. We get these watered down versions, and I can't reiterate that enough. What we start to see in the United States when it comes to minorities is that minorities are gaining greater numerical representation due to increased migration patterns in the United States. From 2000 to 2010, half of the growth that existed in the United States population was the result of an increase in the number of Latino Hispanics residing in the United States, immigrated to the United States. We experienced between this time a population growth of Latinos Hispanics by 43%, as opposed to non-Latino population growing by approximately 5%. And what we want to keep in mind is that this is data we gathered from the 2010 census. What the 2020 census will show us is that although there was growth in the Latino Hispanic community, it most likely doesn't represent the same numbers as it did in 2000 and 2010. From 2010 to 2020, where we're going to see a significant growth is in the Asian American community. The number of Asians immigrating to the United States. How communities are starting to change. Think about it. Communities that were predominantly white, let's say Compton, became predominantly African American, now became a predominantly Latino Hispanic. You're starting to see communities like Arcadia, Monterey Park, Alhambra becoming predominantly Asian. This is the beauty of immigration. This is the beauty of diversity in the United States. So let's look at some information about the Latino Hispanic community, the African American community, the Asian American community, and the Native American community. So once again, some of this information may appear to be dated. It's because it's off the 2010 census. We're still waiting on the 2020 census. So in 2010, Latinos, Hispanics made up approximately about 16% of the American population, just under 50 million. We've exceeded that number today. The Latino Hispanic community is considered the largest ethnic minority group in the United States. And in 2009, 2010, the average family income for Latino Hispanics was just over $40,000. Now, I want you to take this into consideration and try to visualize this with me. It's a lot easier when I have a whiteboard behind me and I could write on that board. But at $40,000 for approximately 4 family members, and that is a dual income or a single income. Well, $40,000 a year comes out to about maybe $2,300 a month. $2,300 a month living in Los Angeles doesn't get you far. Because let's say rent, and I think I'm being very conservative here, but let's say rent's $1,500. That means you have $800 to take care of all your additional expenses. That makes it very challenging. And I want you to think about that experience with financial struggle. That is common to many individuals within ethnic and racial minority groups. And it's not exclusive to us. Granted, the white population does struggle with poverty and low income status also. But let's look at ethnic and racial minority communities. $40,000 makes it incredibly difficult to save money, makes it incredibly difficult to plan for a rainy day, right? Makes it incredibly difficult to save enough money to purchase a home and then to afford a house. Just keep that in mind. As of 2010, 78% of Latino Hispanic households are family households, typically buying into the traditional family model of a father, mother, and children. Now, we have seen in recent years an increase of male-male, female-female-led households. So that data will look significantly different come the 2020 census. Now, when we look at Latino Hispanic culture, we know that women at times, depending on how the family is structured, Latinas may be encouraged in a more traditional setting to suffer in silence, right? Latinos are less likely to divorce. But what we find also based on data is that Latino Hispanic women tend to be less satisfied with a marriage that is deeply rooted in traditional gender roles, where there may be a high level of conflict, perhaps abuse. About 55% of Latinas have reported being violently victimized by an intimate partner. This domestic abuse is oftentimes linked to machismo, that perceived male dominance and power in relationships. Now, what we're also seeing, on the other hand, is that dynamic within the family, it's changing. That culture of you have to serve your partner, you have, assume a traditional heterosexual relationship, the idea that a woman is there to tend to the needs of her husband, well, that's changing. More and more relationships across the board, across all races and ethnicities, but let's look at the Latino Hispanic population, are being redefined. People are saying, you know what? There's not going to be a social hierarchy in a relationship. We're going to be equal partners in our relationship. And you're especially seeing that among the younger generations of Latino Hispanic male and females. This idea of a partnership as opposed to a male-dominated household. According to studies, about 69% of Latino Hispanics believe that children are very important for a successful marriage. Now, in my marriage and family life class, we actually talk about this. Children can be beneficial to a marriage or relationship when that marriage or that relationship is healthy. Believe it or not, children add stress to relationships. And so if your relationship is not healthy, if your relationship is not successful and your bright idea is, hey, let's have kids, things are going to get better, stop right there. Because it only intensifies whatever stresses exist within that relationship. Whatever issues exist within that relationship will certainly be highlighted with the introduction of children. So just keep that in mind. The Latino Hispanic population has the highest birth rate out of any ethnic or racial minority group. 99.1 births for every 1,000 women. The Latino Hispanic population has the highest rate of teenage pregnancies. When we look at birth rates by race or ethnicity to unwed mothers, Latinos, Hispanics are third on that list at just under 48%. African Americans at 70%, Native Americans at 63%, the white population at 25%, and the Asian population at 16%. I want to make something abundantly clear. There is nothing wrong with being an unwed mother or unwed father. There's a stigma that certain individuals may place on us at times. But perhaps from your experiences, and I know from my experiences, I know unwed mothers and unwed fathers who are phenomenal parents. And then I know some married parents who are not phenomenal parents. I know some teenagers who are phenomenal parents. And I know some grown adults who aren't. So we need to learn to rid ourselves of our prejudices and not place stigmas on individuals. One of the major issues that we're facing in the Latino Hispanic population is education. We have the highest dropout rate out of any ethnic or racial minority group. What we find is that our students are less adequately prepared for school. There may be perceived feelings of being treated unfairly by school policies. Parents may read less to their preschool age children in Latino Hispanic households. Now that's changing as well. But I want you to think about this. Schools that cater to ethnic and racial minorities are typically underfunded. We don't have access to the same resources that schools in wealthier communities may have. I want you to think about this factor, and consider that most of my research has been done in education and in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the recommended amount of students per every one counselor is about 350. That's the recommended amount in high schools. Now, what we really see, though, is sometimes a counselor may be in charge of 500, 700, 800 students. Well, what kind of academic advising can someone provide 800 students in one academic year? Think about your own experiences, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about education later on in future lectures. How often did you meet with your academic advisor or your academic counselor while in high school? When I was a high school counselor, I was a college counselor. And 100% of my students were admitted to four-year universities. 97% of my students went to four-year universities, and 100% of my students went to college. I worked at a Catholic school, a low-income Catholic school that was predominantly Latino Hispanic, but I only had 96 students that I was in charge of. And I interacted with my students on a daily basis. The school that I worked at, we had engineering majors, and the seniors who I was in charge of had their engineering classes on last period of the day. So every day, in between all my meetings during the day and also after school, I'd make it a point to visit each one of their classrooms to provide an update related to colleges and universities or whatever was happening on campus, so that students knew that I was present. And as I was walking around, students were able to schedule appointments with me for the following day or following week. We were a predominantly Latino Hispanic high school. We were predominantly low-income, lower middle class high school. But I had that ability to be effective because I only had 96 students. I would not have been as effective if I had 800 students. And that's what we start to see, that when students feel that they're being ignored, when they're being forgotten, their commitment to education may not necessarily always be there. Sometimes they need some guidance, or actually a lot of times they need guidance. They're asking for help and they grow frustrated because they can't get that help. Our school system engages at times in tracking, which we'll talk about when we talk about education. Latinos, Hispanics, African Americans are historically discriminated against by a tracking system, which uses test scores to determine if you're going to be in advanced classes or remedial classes. And we'll talk about that later on. But I want you to understand my frustration with the breakdown in the education system and how we are failing our students of ethnic and racial minority status, and how we are failing many of our students who are coming from low-income and poverty-stricken communities. Let's look at the African American population. As of 2010, the African American population was roughly under 40 million, or just under 13%. Now, it exceeds 13%. Over half of African American families are led by single-parent households. The African American population has the smallest percentage of married adults, one of the highest rates of divorce, and some of the highest percentages of individuals who have never been married. African American children are far more likely to be living with a single mother who has never been married. What we understand about African American or Black unemployment rates in the United States is that they are double that of whites. That the median income of African American families is less than 2/3 of that of whites. In 2009, 2010, the median income was at just under $40,000, so a little less than the Latino Hispanic community for a family of four. Going back to these numbers, you're looking at, again, just under $2,300 a month. How do people survive? Well, we could argue that this is a system of economic deprivation. We know from studies that based on an individual's name or placing one's picture on a job application can limit an individual's ability to secure that job, to even be invited for an interview. That people, employers at times, will discriminate based on a person's perceived race or ethnicity, based on a person's name. And we see this especially playing out in the Latino Hispanic community and the African American community. The lower marriage rates, the higher proportion of female-headed households within the African American community can be attributed to a variety of factors. Some of those factors may include the disproportionate number of African American men in jails and prisons, the idea of guilty until proven innocent, this idea that African American men may not have all the opportunities that white males may have, that African American men are oftentimes approached by law enforcement officers with a high degree of anxiety. And think about what happens when you're anxious. Now, as you're thinking about what happens when you're anxious, couple that with being socialized in a culture that has historically turned young African American males between the ages of 18 to 35 years old into villains. We see images in the media, in movies and television screens that depict African American males not as doctors and lawyers and teachers, but as drug dealers and criminals. And think about if you're a young police officer, you just entered the force, 23 years old, and you've repeatedly seen these images of Black males as criminals or drug dealers or gang members, whatever you want to classify. It's going to cloud your judgment in your interactions with young African American males. You're more inclined, due to the anxiety and due to these prejudices, to overreact to situations. And then we see the executions of young African American males. And it's not just exclusive to African American males, but young African American males being executed, murdered by law enforcement officers. See, as ethnic and racial minorities, particularly those in the Latino, Hispanic, and African American community, we're not afforded oftentimes a second chance. Due to this guilty until proven innocent mentality that has plagued American society. If we make one simple mistake, it could cost us our lives. A law enforcement officer says, "Can I have your ID?" and you move too quickly to grab your wallet from your pocket, you might get shot. Because we are plagued with negative stereotypes. Then we go a step further. Think about the higher mortality rate for young Black males because of gang violence on the streets. And remember, gangs are not exclusive to African Americans. Gangs are not exclusive to Latinos, Hispanics. But then when you hear about gangs on TV, that's all they show us. Well, guess what? You go to the south side of Boston, you're going to see Irish and Italian gangs. But how often do you see a white gang on TV? If I go to North Dakota, you think I'm going to find an African American gang or Latino Hispanic gang? No, I'm going to find white gangs in North Dakota and South Dakota and Wyoming. But I want you to think about this. See, people are quick to highlight the problems that exist within our communities. The fact that Chicago had the most homicides in 2015. That Chicago continues to have a significant level of street violence that is costing society a tremendous amount. And I don't even mean in financial dollars. I mean in the loss of human life, in the loss of young human life. See, why do we have gangs? Why do we have street violence? Well, there's a variety of factors, and we're not going to go into that in great detail in this class. I'll save that for a criminology class. But we can argue poverty plays a role, a lack of opportunities. Think about it. The best job in your neighborhood's a Walmart. The best job in your neighborhood's a Target. It drives me nuts when I interact with representatives, city council representatives in communities that are predominantly Latino, Hispanic, African American, or just ethnic or racial minority in general. And they tell me, we brought jobs. I'm like, great. Now, how many of those jobs provide a livable wage? How many of those jobs provide opportunities so that they become careers? Are you bringing the Ernst & Youngs? Are you bringing the Korn Ferries? Are you bringing in these large corporations that pay $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year? Why is it that in ethnic and racial minority communities, we have to be satisfied with lower wage jobs, with minimum wage jobs? We don't have to be satisfied. We could demand more. Why is it that in ethnic and racial minority communities, in low-income communities in general, across all races or ethnicities, we have to be satisfied with failing schools? We don't have to be satisfied with failing schools. But here's the challenge for us. How do we develop that voice? How do we hold people accountable and say, give us an equal opportunity too? Suspend your prejudices, suspend your stereotypes, and realize A, that I'm a human being, and B, that I want a bright future too. Think about how young African Americans, and also Latino Hispanics, but let's focus on African American adolescents, are forced in many ways to grow up at a younger age. The idea that African Americans have to be book smart and street smart, that they have to know how to navigate through the social world, knowing that regardless of where I go, I'm going to face some level of prejudice, not based on the context or the contents of my character, but rather based on my skin color. That I know that I'm being judged every single time I step outside of the house. Now let's look at the Asian American community. In 2010, we're looking at about 14.4 million individuals, roughly just under 5% of the American population. That has exceeded 5% in 2020. When we look at the Asian American community, most of the Asian Americans in the United States are from China, the Philippines, if we want to throw Filipinos into the mix of Asian Americans. Sometimes we separate the Filipino community, but for this case, we'll include the Filipino community. India, think about it. A lot of Americans don't realize that Indians from India are also Asian. Vietnam, Korea. More than half of the Asian population resides in the western half of the United States. Now, the life experiences of the Asian American community from a financial standpoint are different than that of the Latino Hispanic or the African American community. The average income for a family of four in the Asian American community qualifies as middle class at $73,000 a year. Now in California, you're still going to struggle off $73,000 a year for a family of four, but you're going to be a little more comfortable than those who are making $40,000 than those who are making under $40,000 a year. We look at education. And this is not exclusive to the Asian American community. But what we find oftentimes in the Asian American community is a high value on education. 86% of Asian Americans have completed high school. 49% of Asian Americans hold an undergraduate degree, as opposed to 27% of Americans in general. High levels of educational attainment can be attributed to a variety of factors, right? Fulfilling the expectations of parents, right? Without questioning parental authority. A strong interdependence among family members. This idea that you're going to care for older generations, so you need to be financially secure. The idea that at times, depending on the family, education may be closely associated with pride, with honor within the family. In the Asian American community, we see the smallest proportion of divorces. A majority of households are married. But what we see, similar to traditional Latino Hispanic culture, is that in traditional Asian culture, men are elevated above women. And we're only talking about very traditional, very strict culture here. We're not saying all Asian Americans or all Latino Hispanics engage in these behaviors. Husbands are expected to serve as the breadwinners, while wives are expected to manage children and the household in very traditional families. But what we also see is a high rate of domestic violence within the Asian American community. In a struggle between traditional male dominance and a more equitable role between males and females, assuming traditional heterosexual relationship here, in the United States. We see children being socialized at times into obedience, loyalty, self-control. And so what we find in schools is that the Asian American population, especially that of students, have lower forms or experiences of delinquency or misbehavior in schools. Now let's look at the Native American population. As I mentioned before, at one point in the Americas, the Native American population was 100% of the population. Now it's less than 1%, approximately 3.1 million. Majority of Native Americans identify as American Indians, Eskimos, and Aleuts. The average age of Native Americans is 31.9 years old, so 32 years old, as opposed to the average age of the American population being roughly about 36 years old. A majority of Native Americans reside in California, in Arizona, and Oklahoma. About 76% of Native Americans hold a high school diploma, but only 13% hold an undergraduate degree. And let's keep it real. Education is a major issue within the Native American community because of substandard housing conditions, because of substandard hospitals, and because of substandard schools. Native American reservations at times will resemble that of a third world or developing country. They don't have the same access to resources. Schools are heavily underfunded. About a quarter of Native American families live in poverty. We see high rates of fertility, high rates of drug abuse, alcoholism, health problems. The Native American community has the highest proportion of murder rates based on the size of the population, and high levels of child neglect. All of this is related to poverty. Native American children have a history of experiencing low states of well-being. We see one of the highest rates of abuse towards women and children within the Native American community. We see a large number of single-parent households. We see a significant amount of households or children being raised by grandparents. The Native American community experiences high rates of depression and attempted suicide. The help isn't there. The support and resources aren't there for the Native American community. America has consistently turned its back on the Native American community. And the only time, well, not the only time, but many times, the attention that is paid to the Native American community is when America seeks to degrade them. It's when America seeks to deprive them or strip them of whatever limited resources or land they may have. So let's talk about racism. And racism is a prejudice that asserts that members of one race are inferior to another. This making this group less worthy of fair treatment. The idea that one group is viewed as superior and that one group is viewed as inferior leads to discrimination. You think about this. Discrimination coupled with racism leads to disparities in privilege, leads to disparities in power, leads to oppression occurring. Now, why does racism exist? Well, some people believe that races exist. Well, race does not exist. Remember, race is based on physical characteristics. That each race has distinct genetic differences that determine intelligence, that determine ability. That is false. That is a rhetoric that has been adopted by racists generation after generation after generation. And that racial inequality is based on these differences. Racial inequality is based on imaginary differences that some racists came up with years and years ago. Let's look at racism in the United States. Let's look at the fact that Native American children, teenagers, were forced to assimilate into American culture. And that's what we see on the picture in the top left-hand corner. A young Native American male forced to assimilate into American culture. Most likely went to an American school where he was stripped of his culture, where he was stripped of his identity, where he was stripped of his faith, and taught to buy into this American ideology. Yet, when he left that school and he entered mainstream society, he may have looked like an American, he may have dressed like an American, he may have talked like an American, he may have believed in the Christianity of what he was taught is American, but he was not treated as an American. He was taught or socialized into the ideology of the dominant group. He was socialized into the ideology of the in-group. But his status as the other forces him to be a member of the out-group. We look at the picture on the right-hand side. In the middle is what the ideal white male's head should look like. It was this idea that if your head's large, you must have a large brain, therefore you must be highly intelligent. And we saw this in newspapers, we saw this in books, where they would then place this picture next to the left-hand side, which was supposed to be an Irish individual, and on the right-hand side, which was supposed to be an African-American individual, as a way to display the differences in head shape to suggest, once again, that the white male, particularly those from England, were superior in intelligence. We see this sign during the Japanese concentration camps right after Pearl Harbor. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. The term Jap is a derogatory term used to degrade the Japanese community. My buddy James, who I had mentioned a while ago, remember seeing these signs throughout his childhood, right? Even after Japanese concentration camps, even after Pearl Harbor, these signs were still in existence. The Japanese community still faced a considerable amount of discrimination. We look at this image here. The most recently discovered wild beast. This image was shared in newspapers, in journals in the 1880s to degrade the Irish American. See, Irish Americans faced a high level of discrimination as well. Another picture here. We don't want any Japs back here ever, right? You have this image depicting Irish individuals as alcoholics, Irish individuals as corrupt. The left-hand side. This was in newspapers and journals. It reads, the Yellow Terror. The idea that Chinese immigrants were going to kill Lady Liberty, that idea that Chinese immigrants were going to take over American culture. And then you look at this, the idea that racism is not innate, meaning that you're not born racist, you're taught to be racist. Look at these kids so happy to be holding these signs that say, down with the Japs, the rats. Racism is taught from generation to generation. Now I'm going to give you a disclaimer. The next photo is another tough photo to look at. It's of a public lynching. Think about the mentality that someone has to have, not only to lynch a person, but then to pose for a picture. And you look at this individual on the right-hand corner, smiling in a suit. How disgusting is this? The idea that these individuals were arrested for being in the wrong part of town. Remember, there were sundown laws that said basically if you were African American or a person of color, you were not allowed in certain communities once the sun went down. But these individuals were arrested, these individuals were beaten and tortured and hung, or lynched, I should say. This is America's history. More photos of forced assimilation for Native Americans. Look at this. Protect yourself from the menace. The Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, is anti-Jew, anti-Negro, anti-Catholic, anti-foreigner, anti-labor. Now you can throw in anti-LGBTQ, anti-Latino Hispanic, anti-Muslim. I mean, I don't know what the KKK is in favor of. And remember, the KKK identifies as a Christian organization. Now, we oftentimes think of the KKK as being in, the South or the Midwest. There's a KKK presence in Whittier. Not too long ago, the KKK went fishing. And what I mean by that is not literally that they went fishing, but what they do is they put these pamphlets welcoming you to one of their meetings in a plastic Ziploc bag. They'll put a candy, they'll put a rock in it, and at night they'll drive through neighborhoods and toss them into people's front yards, saying like, hey, join the Klan. What these idiots didn't realize is that the neighborhood that they invited people to, join the KKK in Whittier was predominantly Latino, Hispanic. So one of the groups that they're opposed to, they just invited to join the KKK. And so you want to be mindful of that. You look here, the Chinese Exclusionary Act, right? It says Chinese, no, no, no. Once again, the idea that the Chinese were going to take over America. And this is a picture from the 1940s of the Japanese concentration camps and what these look like. They were not these resorts. You were hidden behind barbed wire. You had guard towers that overlooked the camps to make sure nobody escaped. We have another picture of a public lynching. And once again, the horrors, the terrors associated with it. Now, Donald Trump claims to be the most discriminated against and most hated president in American history. But let's keep it real. Look at what Obama had to face. No Obama. Spooks are for Halloween, not Prez. The term spook is a derogatory term used to insult African Americans, to degrade African Americans. Hang in there, Obama. I mean, let's keep it real. Trump was one of the main proponents of this whole birther movement when it came to Obama. Show us your birth certificate. And then when Obama was like, okay, oh, that's a fake birth certificate. I mean, this is absurd. This is absurd that this has existed in American society. This is absurd that it has existed in the 2000s. So we want to believe that we progressed, and we have made some progress, but we still have plenty of room for growth. You have literacy tests, which people are proposing for immigration. The idea that you have to be able to read and write and speak English fluently, as if English is the only language spoken in the United States. We have hundreds of languages spoken in this country, and although individuals believe that English is the official language of the United States, it is the preferred language of the United States, not the official language of the United States. The same way people assume that Christianity is the official official religion of the United States, that is not true. That is the preferred religion among many populations in the United States, but it is not the official religion of the United States because we have a country that is supposed to separate church and states. But this idea of a literacy test, well, guess what? A majority of Americans wouldn't pass that test. When we look at education later on, I'll give you some of the rates of how well people do on these literacy tests. The fact that a majority of Americans are graduating from high schools and they are not proficient in reading or writing. Imagine if I was to give this test, how many American citizens would be stripped of their citizenship because they couldn't pass this exam? We went through this part already. Think about how racism has long been used to justify the mistreatment of certain groups of people. From Native Americans to African Americans to immigrant workers, right? We hear immigrants are stealing our jobs, immigrants are stealing our jobs. When we really should be focusing on the fact that jobs and higher paying jobs are disappearing in America because they're being shipped overseas for cheaper labor and less governmental restrictions. We see hate groups in existence, the KKK perhaps being one of the more prominent hate groups. We have the Proud Boys, who are a hate group, right? We have neo-Nazis, the skinheads that are hate groups. These are groups that promote hostility and violence toward members of other races. Right? And in 2008, we had 926 groups at the conclusion of the Obama administration. That went up to north of 1,000 hate groups. We look at prejudice versus discrimination. Minority groups have faced prejudice from the dominant group. And prejudice is basically very rigid generalizations, oftentimes negative, about an entire category of people. Prejudices are often reinforced by stereotypes, and when we use the concept of stereotypes, we're talking about very simplified, very extreme perceptions about an entire group of people based on false assumptions. As I've stated before, if you're going to accept positive stereotypes, then you best be prepared to accept negative stereotypes. And prejudice and stereotypes, if they're not challenged, can lead to discrimination. And when we use the term discrimination, we're talking about the deliberate, the intentional, unfair treatment of people based on prejudice. We talk about institutional discrimination and how personal biases can corrupt our social structures, how social institutions may end up replicating and supporting racial and ethnic inequality, that we have institutional discrimination that basically provides an advantage to the dominant group and provides an appearance of fairness to others, which we know is not fair, is not equal. Think about separate but equal legislation, right? Plessy versus Ferguson. And this idea that, well, as long as you offer similar facilities, technically, you could separate individuals. So we could have a whites only class and a people of color class or blacks only class. See, you both have classrooms, but the question is, what type of resources are available in those classes? Well, you both have books. Great. This classroom has books from 2018, and this classroom has books from 1976. And then we see Brown versus Board of Education that says, separate is not equal. And we start to see the desegregation of schools in the 1950s. What we want to understand is that minority groups are more likely to be poor when compared to the white majority. As I mentioned before, poor children are less likely to attend quality schools. We see higher rates of poverty can lead poor people, and by extension minorities, to live in environmentally dangerous neighborhoods. Think about the town of Norco, Louisiana. Before the devastation brought about by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, poor Black residents were struggling with all these environmental hazards brought about by local shell chemical plants. People suffer from health conditions. We see this in Boyle Heights, for example, where there were battery factories that contaminated the soil. People are developing cancer, people are getting sick, and there's a continuous lawsuit going on. These are things that you wouldn't see in South Pasadena, that you wouldn't see in Friendly Hills in Whittier, that you wouldn't see in San Marino. Low-income individuals, people of color, are oftentimes exposed to hazardous living conditions. We look at this concept of scapegoating, that frustration with one's current situation can lead to prejudice, which can then lead to people feeling powerless, which can then lead to scapegoating, essentially to unfairly accuse another group as being the cause of the problem. Blaming immigrants because you don't have a job. Blaming women entering the workforce for you not having a job. That is scapegoating. This idea that you're not willing to look at the situation as a whole, that you're not willing to adopt the sociological imagination and understand that your personal troubles are a reflection of larger social issues that are taking place. The idea that your situation is not only exclusive to you, that other individuals are suffering too. Think about the coal mines. You hear politicians arguing, we need to bring coal mines back. Coal mines provided livable wages. Yeah, coal mines did pay pretty well in some areas of the country. But what was the risk factor associated with coal mines? People developed black lung, people developed cancer, people got very sick. The coal mines, once they dried up, basically created ghost towns of poverty, right, throughout the United States. You want to take all this into consideration. Why did coal mines disappear? It wasn't because of immigrants. Coal mines disappeared, or are disappearing, I should say, because of advancements in technology. So if you want to launch a war, if you want to blame someone, blame technological innovations. And if we're doing that, then let the payphone people, those people who've invested heavily in payphones, hopefully everyone knows what a payphone is. You don't see many around. It's the same way someone who owns payphones would blame cell phone companies. Technology changes life. Technology makes certain industries obsolete. When was the last time you walked into a Blockbuster or a Hollywood Video? It's a lot more convenient to just stream a movie than it is to physically go out and rent a movie. So I want you to take that in consideration, this idea of scapegoating. And think about situations or experiences of scapegoating that you see on television, that you read in magazines or newspapers. Right? The idea that one undocumented immigrant commits a crime, and somehow people in our society blame all undocumented immigrants. That's scapegoating.